Hello, and welcome to Spirit Travels, where we narrate the extraordinary experiences of people who have glimpsed the other side of death. My name is Maureen, and I will be your narrator on this journey. If you enjoy this content, please make sure to like and subscribe to support our channel. Now let's begin.
Hello, everyone. This is Maureen from Spirit Travels, and today I have a very special guest, Adam. Adam is going to tell you about his near-death experience. Take it away, Adam.
Yeah, so my name's Adam Tapp. I've been a paramedic for 20 years now, co-founder of Avail Scientific and the host of the Tapped into Psychedelics podcast. And I was electrocuted to death on February 28th, 2018, and I was technically dead for around 11 and a half minutes. And so I do woodworking as sort of a hobby, and I find it somewhat cathartic with the contrast of being paramedic work, which obviously is stressful. And a friend of mine wanted a specific wood etching sort of pattern done. And by all means, I am not endorsing this. This is just sort of a description of what happened, but you take a microwave transformer and you strip away every possible safety feature and you plug it into a wall. So 110 volts alternating current turns into about 12,000 volts direct current. Wow. And you do this and it etches these coral patterns into wood, and it burns, it smokes, and it's an interesting thing to do. And so we were doing this. It was probably around 6, 7 o'clock at night. And conveniently, my friend had taken a high voltage safety course about 2 weeks previous, which is profoundly convenient, or we'd both be dead. And we were having a conversation. I was moving the electrodes one at a time, and it was really humid. And I think it just arced into my hand. And I remember I was mid-conversation with him about something, probably irrelevant. And it was just like someone flicked a switch. And it was pain that was almost beyond comprehension. It was just like every single cell in my body was being torn into pieces. And I remember like I wasn't aware of anything. It was just these vertical cylinders that were iridescent green that just seemed to go up and down forever. Like there was no visual awareness of anything other than just this intense pain and energy. And I remember I couldn't think. It was just so much energy. And I remember focusing and thinking, I'm being electrocuted. And then I had this thought that I'm not breathing. And then I felt like I was falling for this prolonged period of time. And then all of a sudden I just woke up just in this place seemingly that I'd always been. And it was this beautiful inky darkness with these lights. Like it seemed sort of like it was outer space somewhere in the galaxy. It's hard to describe, but I remember very specifically seen from a single point spherically outwards. And I know that doesn't make sense, but like we have two eyes in the front of our head. They look forward. It gives us depth perception. But this was just seeing everything from a single point, or experiencing, because seeing seems kind of counterintuitive at that point. And I wasn't dead. I wasn't alive. I wasn't Adam. I wasn't anything. I was just raw awareness, and it was perfect. It was absolute contentment, if that even makes sense. And then I sort of felt this frequency washing over me, and it was like woof, 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 and it was like these fractal patterns like gasoline on water, and it was almost like this juxtaposition of thoughts and feelings and emotions from something else external. And I guess you could say that what it was telling me was everything's okay, which I didn't even think that anything couldn't be okay at this moment. And I felt myself just sort of being pulled into pieces and sort of like merging with this fabric of the universe, like becoming infinite. And again, in that moment, it felt so profoundly natural. Like this simply just is what happens. There's no question. There's no concern, no fear. It was just perfect. And then all of a sudden I felt myself being electrocuted again. And at the time, I had no idea what was going on. But in hindsight, I was defibrillated twice because I was in a ventricular fibrillation arrhythmia, which basically means your heart's just spasming and doing nothing productive. And so my coworkers, who I've known for years, had arrived at that point and had put defibrillation pads on me. So they were defibrillating me, which the defibrillation takes about 0.5 seconds. But this was like this prolonged electrocution. And I remember I kind of snapped me back into cognition, I guess you could say, where all of a sudden now I'm Adam again. I'm aware of the fact I'm dead. I'm floating in space in an absence of a body of raw awareness. And the time just passed. And I remember being like, oh, wow, I'm dead. This is death. And I think I just simply existed and was coming to terms with a lot of things about myself and who and what I am and the experience that had just happened. And then I started being electrocuted again, which is the second defibrillation. And then at some point in time during that period of electrocution, they got a ROSC, which is a return of spontaneous circulation. So my heart started beating again. And then I felt like I'm maybe being pulled or sucked, if that even makes sense. And I think I was cognizant of being back in my body. And I think maybe the smell of burnt flesh, I have like a reminiscent memory of that. And that would have been in my finger that was burned off. And I had 3rd-degree burns all over this hand. And then I was in a coma for about 8 hours, maybe. And I remember waking up in the ICU. And now everyone thought I was brain dead, which is problematic for everyone else. But, you know, I was just, it seemed like a second. But I remember like I, you know, was intubated, tubes in my lungs. I had a interosseous needle drilled into my bone for medication access. But I remember waking up and everyone, you know, the hugs, and I got extubated. I remember the first thing I said was like, how long has it been? And they told me, but if someone had told me it'd been like 5 years and I had this big beard, it would have made sense. Like it was amazing, this complete disconnect from my physical body and what we perceive as reality. But then I was lying there and I became so hyper aware of my body. Like I remember like touching my arm and I was smelling myself, and our natural pheromonal smell, not what we perceive as like BO where we put deodorant on, but like our natural pheromonal smell, which is where primates, all mammals have this smell. I was so hyper aware of it, but I never would normally because I was acclimatized to it. But I stunk. Like my natural body, everything about it, my skin, peeing, pooping, everything was just disgusting to me. Not disgusting, but just laborious. It's like I just got downgraded from this supercomputer of infinite consciousness back down to like this 16-bit, you know, Commodore 2000 pixelated nonsense. And, you know, it was a very bizarre experience of having an absolute disconnect to something that I've only ever known as being in a physical body, being a talking monkey, if I can say that. And then being back into this body where I'm hormonally mandated to feel anxiety and stress and hunger and, you know what I mean? All these emotions. It was overwhelming to be back in this body. And I remember, you know, it took me months to sort of get over that. I remember even saying to my wife, I'm like, this isn't real. and she was a little alarmed by that, but it really didn't. This, what we're perceiving now, to me was a dream, and being dead was the absolute reality. Like it actually took me months to sort of just acclimatize back to this. And, you know, and I didn't really want to read about other people's near-death experiences because I just wanted to be with mine and not have it sort of tainted. I guess that's a reasonable way to say that. But I did have the photophobia where I'd be wearing sunglasses all the time just because, you know, even light from, you know, a fixture above the kitchen would be blinding to me to some extent. And my hands, I had 3rd-degree burns all over my hand, and obviously my finger was burned off. And it was interesting that I was told I was going to need skin grafts. And then within almost 3 weeks, everything started healing like really rapidly and aggressively, which was kind of a cool thing. And yeah, it was a very interesting experience. And I would say in a lot of contexts, I think, you know, I would say that I was never really been religious in the sense of an organized, structured religion, but I've always been spiritual. But I think I realized that I was superficially spiritual. And now after you have that experience, you're like, no, it's, you know, there's definitely something else, and something else of seemingly infinite complexity.
Yeah. I mean, I think your story is amazing. And I like when I listen to near-death experience stories, I think the natural inclination is for people to try and imagine it or picture it, right? But I know that so many people who've had near-death experiences always say that it's not something that's easily like conceivable in our current state.
Well, if you think about it, we lack language to describe it. Like, you know, our entire language has developed to describe things around us, things that are small and large within our visual range of understanding, sounds, everything. But then all of a sudden you have an experience that is independent of this reality, and the vernacular breaks down. Like it's, and it's something else too. It's not something you can describe. It's more something that you can just simply be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's, you don't have a choice. You just
gave the example of like taking like a 2D person and putting them like a 4D world and then asking them to describe it. What do you think of that? Of that?
Well, I actually, that's a really good analogy. Because like for me, another thing about this too is like, you know, as far as I'm concerned, my near-death experience was an endogenous dimethyltryptamine release in our brain. And dimethyltryptamine is commonly known as NN-DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic. It's in ayahuasca. It's present in our bodies all the time. It's thought to be associated with dreaming. There's a release of it during death. And I've done a lot of psychedelics, and I honestly don't see a difference. I don't think you can separate psychedelic experiences from death experiences. I think that they overlap so significantly. And the idea of embodying something in experience, it's so significantly similar that I find it hard to even dispute it. You know, it's an interesting thing. There's a book called The Immortality, and it's about these Greek rituals that Aristotle, Socrates, you know, Cicero of the Romans, everyone participated in. And it was the Elysian Mysteries, where they would use basically ergot, which is a precursor for LSD. And, you know, these forefathers, parents of democracy, if you will, were all doing these massive amounts of LSD. And their whole motto behind this is that you can die in life so that you can truly live. You know, and having these psychedelic experiences and having a near-death experience, I don't think you could interpret it any other way. You know,
that's an interesting idea. So if you're saying that you suspect that the experience is caused by a release of chemicals in your brain when you die, are you saying that you don't think that like your consciousness actually exists after your brain activity ceases?
No, I would say that consciousness exists all around us, and that I'm just simply an expression of it, limited by my biology. Much like a dog and a cat are conscious, and they are expressions of conscious limited by a feline or canine biology.
Material body. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, well, like really from the whole experience that I had, is that we're just facets of an infinite complexity and experience itself subjectively. And you know, that may or may not make sense to people, but it certainly does after you've had the experience, where it's just, you know, there's an infinite complexity that exists and permeates all aspects of reality, or what we perceive as reality. And we're just experiencing this through our specific biological lens as an individual to grant subjective knowledge of oneself. And
that has a lot of theological implications too, because then, like for me, I'm a person of faith, so I'm a Christian, but I would be really interested to hear what you think about now that you had this experience. What do you think about the idea of the reality that you express being something that was orchestrated by a higher or superior intelligence versus just kind of like a coincidental thing that happened in the universe?
I would say, well, it's an interesting perspective. And here's my perspective on organized religion. And I'm in no way trying to be, you know, derogatory. But to me, like, all religions are generally a geographic lottery, trying to explain the same thing. Like if you and I were born, you know, somewhere in northern India, we could be Jain, we could be Buddhist, we could be Hindu. It really depends on where you're born and the culture that you're put into. And all of them are fundamentally trying to express something relatively similar. We just anthropomorphize it. We apply these human attributes to what we perceive as a deity or God. And, you know, like all these ideas of this bearded man in the sky, or these pantheon of gods, all with reminiscent human features, just allows people to relate to something that is unrelatable. And to me, everything's just trying to express an infinite complexity. and because of our own ideas of self, whereas I'm Adam and you're Maureen, it seems to be a separation from this. Whereas at the end of the day, we're all the exact same thing. We're all just facets of this infinite complexity, which one could quantify as God.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
That actually leads me to a question that I had for you, which was in regards to, in this world, we seem to value individual identity a lot. Like we are very focused on our individual identities and what our identities are and what we root them in. And you mentioned that in your near-death experience, you kind of were no longer Adam. You were like this point of consciousness. And so my question is, did you still maintain an individual identity? And what was that like?
Well, I will say something interesting about this is that the idea of individual identity is reminiscent to what culture you're from. Like in Buddhism, the idea of an individual or non-dualism is something that people are striving towards if you're actually a Buddhist, is the reduction of a sense of self. So the idea of an individual identity is more associated with Western cultures. And you know what I mean? So it's sort of an interesting proposition where it's like, a friend of mine's a Buddhist, and he's a neuroscientist, and I interviewed him on my podcast. His name's Siddharth, and we were having that specific conversation about, Buddhism growing up that way. It was less of an idea about me as the individual as opposed to everything as a single unison group. And so it's an interesting concept where it's like, well, is this just a cultural expression of identification? But to answer the question specifically is that in that experience, I didn't exist as Adam. There was not even a single reminiscent spot of me that was reflective of Adam and who and what I am as I see myself as an identity. And go.
Sorry. I was just going to ask. So is it kind of like, how does that compare to, like, for example, being asleep, where you're not thinking about your own individuality when you're asleep? You're just kind of existing in this like sleep-like state.
And interesting too is that we spent like a third of our life in an altered state of consciousness by dreaming. And again, too, it's thought that dreams can be responsible for DMT or dimethyltryptamine as influencing us in these places. Now, in the idea of a dream, like, I know what you mean about the idea of not having an identity, but I don't think it was ever so significant as being dead. And even like psychedelics can actually elicit this state too. It's called an ego death or an ego dissolution. 5-MeO-DMT very specifically does that, where you achieve a point where you simply have no identity. You're just everything and nothing. Wow. And it's a very profound experience. And I think, nirvana as a state of being in Buddhism is kind of a similar aspect of an idea of simply being everything or nothing in absence of an identity. But, at the same time, too, coming back from that experience and then being back in as Adam, it was a very interesting experience from being nothing or everything, if you want to call it that, which is not something that you can even really comprehend, to being something very specific with an identity, with a family, with ideas, thoughts, belief structures. And it was funny that it took me a bit to sort of like remember who I was.
And how would you say that it affected your daily life and your relationships?
I would say that it's one of those things that it's hard to quantify, like a very significant shift in oneself. But I would say that I find it a lot easier to simply appreciate being in a moment as opposed to having to apply meaning to a moment, if that makes sense. Like I notice a lot when I'm with my daughter. She's 14 months old and she's adorable. Oh, no, she's so cute. And I'll just be in a moment with her where I'm not thinking about anything else other than just simply being in the moment. I'm not trying to attribute meaning to it or plan on it or use it as a platform to create some new idea. It's just simply being in a moment. And awesome. I feel like I'm significantly calmer. And again, my ideas of mortality, I think that we're all afraid of death. Yeah. And I don't even mean that in a negative way, but it's just like, if we weren't afraid of death and that wasn't a biological mechanism, then we would not be here. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, let's be realistic. Like, if our ancestors were hanging out, standing at the edge of the cave, and there was this growling coming from it, and one of them was like, "I'm going in," and he died and didn't, you know, proliferate his genetic material, and the other one, who was more timid and concerned about his mortality, you know, backed off. We are genetically programmed and predisposed to be fearful of death, of
these survivors,
of wounds. Yeah, it's a surviving instinct. And so we're all inherently afraid of it. And hence, I think a lot of the reason behind religion, with the ideas of paradise, heaven, hell, all these different things, gives us some sense of meaning in our life, as well as afterwards, whatever that might mean to someone. And I think that, not that I have this belief structure where we go to what one might perceive as a heaven as we anthropomorphically see it, but it just, my fear of mortality is somewhat diminished. I think rather significantly.
That's good. I think, like, I've heard a lot of people, like, across the spectrum of NDEs, mostly positive, that say that their fear of death is pretty much gone. So that's always, like, encouraging to hear, right?
Well, what's interesting about that too is that basically in Canada right now, we have a special access program, and psilocybin, which is the component of magic mushrooms, is actually being granted to people who are palliative. So let's just say that I had stage 4 lymphoma or something, and I was palliative, and I had a justified fear of death. You can actually go to the federal government and apply to have a 3, 4, 5 gram mushroom experience. And it's based off of Johns Hopkins University with Roland Griffith studies. And like 95% of people actually lose their fear of death on these psychedelic experiences, which, again,
incredible.
I hate, you know, bringing this back to the idea of psychedelics being so deeply associated with spirituality, religion, and death or mortality.
I mean, I feel like, I personally am a little bit skeptical about that, but I do understand how they're similar and how they cause similar reactions mentally, emotionally, and stuff like that. I have another question for you.
Yeah.
You haven't mentioned this, so I thought I would ask. When you have had this experience, were you able to hear, see, feel people still on Earth?
No, not at all. There was no awareness of anything that was going on here. I couldn't hear, see, feel anything. I was completely immersed into that experience.
It's blackness, which is like space, you said.
Yeah, like I'm not sure if I was maybe like subconsciously inferring the space to something in an absence of any other stimulus, but I feel like my memory of the experience was it just seemed like this perfect inky blackness, like outer space.
And that's another thing that you have a memory of it is interesting, because doesn't brain activity cease when you die?
It starts to cease. Like that's another interesting thing too, is that, you know, like I wasn't dead. You know, dead is my biological processes have shut down and I'm not coming back from this. You can have it slowed with hypothermia. People can remain dead for 30, 40 minutes and be resuscitated, but your biological mechanism, your metabolism slowed down. You're not building up carbon dioxide and all these other toxins in your body. So my body was in the process of completely shutting down.
Interesting.
And I had this experience. So I would still have neurological activity, because if I had none, and everything was completely shut off, then it'd be very unlikely that I would be having this conversation with you.
I have heard, though, of a woman, I can't remember her name, but she's in Dr. Bruce Grayson's book. And she had all the blood drained from her brain, and she had like things in her ears. And they were monitoring her, and they said that there was no brain activity and she had an NDE. So it's interesting to see the connection between you know, brain and the body and consciousness and spirituality and all that stuff, right? I think everyone's trying to figure it out.
Well, yeah, like people have been sonnets and books and poems and entire religions have been created around the subject matter of your mortality and what happens after you die, right? Like that will always be an unanswerable question. Well, maybe not, but currently it certainly is unanswerable.
Yeah, currently it certainly is.
Yeah.
So since you work as a paramedic, have you ever encountered someone else who, like, I don't know, while you're died and came back while you're working on them, or have you ever
all the time,
like NDEs with other people?
I've had actually quite a few people who will go VSA. So they'll die for whatever reason, usually a heart attack or some variation of that, because that's one of the most easiest things to get someone back from. And then you defibrillate them and they'll wake up. And I would say almost all the time. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard anyone ask, or like, I'll usually say, I'm like, hey, I know this is a big moment for you. You just died, but did you, like, it's finding the appropriateness to ask that question in that moment is, you know what I mean? Like, is this an appropriate question?
Where were you? Yeah.
Start shaking them, answer the question.
Yeah.
But I have asked people, because it can come up when you're talking about people's medical histories, and like, oh yeah, I died for whatever reason. And I'm like, oh, did you see anything? And most people will actually seem to be just the lights went out and then turn back on again, and that's it. And again, it is what it is, right?
Yeah, that's okay. So I asked you about this before we started recording, but I thought maybe it would be cool if you just mentioned it again, the background that you have behind you.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about it, because it looks super cool. It's a mural.
It is.
It's a mural, right?
Yeah, actually, it's a friend of mine made it, and it's basically a mixture of my death, psychedelic use. That massive anaconda was the first time I did ayahuasca, and it's sort of this reminiscence juxtaposition of being dead and psychedelics and all these different things.
And how did that compare, your two experiences?
In the same way that these experiences lack the ability to describe, they would probably lack the ability to differentiate against. You know, I would say they're very similar in the sense of being disassociated from what we perceive as reality and interacting with something else. You know what I mean? Like, it's on these psychedelic experiences, it's very difficult on higher dose ones to not feel that you're interacting with something that's external to you. You know what I mean? Like, you're interacting with something else, some level of reality, some consciousness that is independent of your own.
Wow.
And I feel like that's one of the very significant similarities that I would draw on, is that in my death experience, I was interacting with something that was beyond me, that was above me, that was
something outside of
something external to me. And psychedelic experiences are very similar in that. I think hence why they give this sense of spirituality and alleviate the fear of death, is that you're interacting with something that is beyond, or perhaps it completely encompasses its reality. We just don't have the capacity to interact with it in a normal state of consciousness.
Yeah. Wow. It's a lot to think about. Yeah. Okay. I have one more question for you. What was the most surprising revelation about either your NDE experience or maybe something after it, like tied to it?
Surprising, I guess maybe in two parts to it, was that sort of the dissolution of oneself completely, and then coming back and then being surprised that I'm in this body. That was like one of the more surprising things to me. Was I remember just being like, what is going on? Like, it was,
why am I here?
It was literally like being disassociated forever. And then coming back to a memory that is flawed, if that even makes sense. And, you know, because you got to think on a day-to-day basis, like, how often does your body influence you? You wake up, you're tired, you're hungry, you have all these mechanisms in your body, or maybe feeling anxious or excited or sad, or your stomach's rumbling, you're hungry. You know what I mean? Like, it's constantly influencing you every second of the day. And you're just used to it because you've always had that experience. And then coming back from what one could perceive as a complete disassociation from that makes you really hyper aware of your body and yourself in it. And that is the one thing that was, because I remember like feeling sort of like anxious in the hospital. I'm like, what is this? And I was like, oh yeah, that's part of the
yeah, I remember this feeling. Yeah. Were you disappointed to come back?
Yeah.
But
at the same time, I'm like, well, I'm going back there someday. You know what I mean? Like at the end of death is easy, and let's be realistic. Life is hard, but at the same time, it offers this level of beauty. It offers love. It offers experience. It offers you so many things, laughs and joy, and the contrast of all these good things with bad things that give good things meaning.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like life is just a series of contrasts that give meaning to things. It's beautiful. It's hard. It's scary. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
But
I've heard a couple of people mention that they say that the reason we're even here is just to learn, like to have like these learning
to experience.
Really cool. And okay, I know I said that was the last question, but I have one more.
I got time. You can go all you want.
Okay, perfect. What would you like everyone to know?
That it's okay. You know, like it's, you know, I think at the end of the day, we're all just afraid. We're afraid of not being loved. We're afraid of not being accepted. We're afraid of life. We're afraid of death. We're just afraid of everything. And that's fine. That is what it is meant to be alive, unfortunately. Yeah. But death was beautiful. And I'm not suggesting anyone rush towards it, because we're all going to go there. And I do really deeply believe that life truly is a gift. But at the same time, so's death. Death is a gift too. You know what I mean? It's just you have one before the other. And you know, to anyone who's dying or looking for some kind of validation or answers from these podcasts, it's life is beautiful, but so's death. Death was stunning. It was perfect. It was literally completely, in absolute sense, being perfect.
Wow.
And that's a really bold statement. Like I don't even think we have a definition for perfect.
Yeah, not
you know
on
what
Earth.
I mean? Like no, God no, because perfect doesn't exist. But you are perfect. You simply.
But we have like a sense of what it could be, right? We all have this innate idea of what it could be.
Yeah, I feel like it's a flawed interpretation of what perfect is, because we don't have anything as a comparison. But in that place, that experience, I was perfect, and it was. And that also makes me think that like everything around us, everything is absolute perfection. We just are moving around in it. We're tripping over ourselves, both cognitively, emotionally, physically. We're trying to figure things out, but everything is fundamentally perfect. And you actually finally get to realize that at some point.
And in one of the books that I read with Dr. Bruce Grayson, he posits this idea that our physical bodies might actually be filtering our conscious experience as opposed to creating it. And I thought that was a really cool idea. What do you think about that?
Well, that's kind of what I was saying earlier, that, you know, consciousness fundamentally exists everywhere. Like, well, look at it this way. So from a biological perspective, I'm Adam, I'm sitting here, I'm skin and bone and water. And when you start going down into these smaller levels, so my cellular structure is made up of like proteins and different cells and organelles. And then you go down into these specific molecules. Those are made of atoms. And you go down even further to these subatomic particles. But the vast majority of me is just simply empty space. Like a huge portion of me is empty space. And I know that doesn't make sense, because you're like, well, I can't stick my hand through your face. I'm like, but on an actual accurate level, like I am mostly the space between subatomic particles. And to me, well, it's like the 0 point field, where it's like if the universe is a pointillist expression art piece, the 0 point field is a canvas in which all these polka dots are put onto. And if you look at everything as these single dots of atoms and subatomic particles, and whether they're just, you know, like in quantum field theory, like just waves or frequencies or vibrating strings, it potential or whatever, it's fairly irrelevant. The point is that the vast majority of everything is empty space. And to me, consciousness emanates from empty space, and we simply just filter it with our biology. Kind of equatable to what Grayson was saying.
Really
and
cool.
The idea that we just simply filter out consciousness that exists everywhere.
That is a really cool concept. When I first read that and thought about it, I was like, whoa, that is cool. I've never thought of that before. So yeah, and it's interesting that you have the same idea, that it's like validated. So it's really cool.
Well, it also insinuates that everything is conscious to some extent. You know what I mean? Like, and the lens in which something can, but that's what I mean. Like plants and trees actually interact with their surroundings. They, you know, there's studies being done with mycelial interactions with root systems in forests, and how the entire forest is interacting with one another in itself. And, you know, I think that it's very easy to sit there and say that only humans are consciousness, or that only specific animals are conscious. But at the end of the day, if the entire universe is conscious, then how can you say that something isn't? And it gets down to like a bold statement to be like, well, is a rock conscious?
I was just going to ask
I don't know.
Would you say like things like would you say things that are alive are conscious?
That's what I would say. I'm just posing it as a statement that if you believe consciousness emanates from the space between everything, then does that make an inanimate object conscious? And the idea is like, well, if the universe is conscious, then inherently everything is conscious. It just depends on the scale in which you define consciousness. If consciousness is based on being able to formulate ideas, plans, and thoughts, then obviously I'm conscious. But you even look like an ant. An ant by itself is fairly irrelevant, but you put a bunch of ants together and they can like have agriculture and create complex structures. You know what I mean? Like you have emergence of consciousness from seemingly stupid things. And I say stupid facetiously, obviously, but
really interesting. Wow. Very cool. It's so cool to hear from you. And especially because you have such like a scientific medical kind of background to like posit all of this. So that was really cool. I really appreciate it. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Adam.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on here and telling your story and answering my 1,000,001 questions.
No, it was good. I thought it was entertaining. No, it's
awesome.
All right. Yeah. Well, if people are interested, if people are interested in NDEs and they're exploring this avenue, I would suggest exploring ideas of psychedelics. And I'm not telling anyone to do anything, but explore the idea of it, because in my experience with the people I've interviewed on my podcast and my own personal experiences, these things are so deeply associated with one another. And check out my podcast. It's called Tapped Into Psychedelics, iTunes, Spotify. You can check my Instagram page, Tapped Into Psychedelics. And yeah, it's a series of interesting conversations with interesting people. So
it definitely sounds like it. Thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate it.
No, you're welcome.
I'm definitely going to be checking that out. Guys, check his podcast out.
Thank you for listening. If you have had an NDE that you would like to share, please email us at travelsinthespirit@gmail.com. Until next time, God bless.